People often think they can recognize a troubled marriage. They imagine raised voices behind closed doors, cold silences at dinner tables, or dramatic arguments that leave scars no one can hide. My marriage looked nothing like that. If you had met my husband and me 5 years ago, you probably would have called us lucky. We had been married for nearly 14 years. We lived in a comfortable home, shared responsibilities, and rarely fought. Friends often commented on how stable we seemed. Family members used us as an example of what a successful marriage looked like. From the outside, everything appeared exactly as it should be. And maybe that was part of the problem. When people think everything is fine, they stop asking questions. Eventually, you stop asking them yourself. My husband, Daniel, was a good man. Even now, when I think back on those years, I can't honestly say he was cruel or careless. He worked hard. He paid attention to the practical things that kept our lives running smoothly. If something broke, he fixed it. If I needed help, he was there. If I was sick, he took care of me. But somewhere along the way, we stopped truly seeing each other. The change wasn't sudden. It happened so slowly that neither of us noticed it. Conversations became shorter. The excitement of sharing our days disappeared. We talked about schedules, bills, groceries, and obligations. We discussed everything necessary to maintain a life together, yet somehow avoided talking about ourselves. At first, I assumed it was normal. Every long marriage changes. Passion settles. Routines replace surprises. That's what everyone says. So I accepted it. Months became years. There were evenings when Daniel would sit across from me in the living room, scrolling through work emails while I watched television. We occupied the same space without truly connecting. Sometimes hours passed with only a handful of words exchanged between us. The silence wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was comfortable. Comfortable enough that neither of us felt urgency to change it. I began noticing a strange loneliness growing inside me. It wasn't the loneliness of being alone. It was the loneliness of feeling unseen by someone who was always there. I rarely spoke about it. How could I? Every time I tried to explain my feelings, another voice in my head reminded me of everything I should be grateful for. I had a stable marriage, a reliable partner, a secure life. Many people would have gladly traded places with me. So I convinced myself the emptiness wasn't important. I buried it beneath responsibilities and routines. For a while that worked. Then one ordinary Tuesday changed everything. It happened during a charity event organized by a local community group. I almost didn't attend. I had spent the entire day handling errands and felt exhausted. Daniel couldn't come because of work, so I went alone. The event itself wasn't memorable. What I remember is seeing him. Ethan. The moment I heard his voice, I felt something shift inside me. We had known each other years earlier. Not romantically. Just friends who had crossed paths during a different chapter of life. Back then, we'd shared long conversations, exchanged ideas, and laughed easily together. Eventually, life pulled us in different directions. I hadn't seen him in nearly a decade. Yet standing there, smiling as though no time had passed, he felt strangely familiar. We spent only a few minutes talking that evening. He asked about my life. Not the polite version people usually ask. The real version. He wanted to know how I was doing. At first, I gave automatic answers. Fine. Busy. Everything's good. But unlike most people, he didn't immediately move on. He listened. Really listened. The conversation wasn't dramatic. There was no flirting. No inappropriate comments. Nothing happened that anyone could point to as suspicious. And yet, when I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because of Ethan himself. Because of how I felt during those few minutes. For the first time in years, I felt noticed. I felt interesting. I felt like someone was genuinely curious about what was happening inside my mind instead of simply assuming they already knew. That realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. When I walked through my front door, Daniel was sitting on the couch with his laptop open. He smiled briefly and asked whether the event had gone well. I told him it had. Then he returned to his work. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. As I stood there watching him, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was awareness. An awareness of everything that had been missing for far longer than I had allowed myself to acknowledge. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside me. My life hadn't changed. My marriage hadn't changed. Nothing dramatic had happened. But for the first time in years, I found myself asking a question I had spent a long time avoiding. If everything was truly fine, then why did one simple conversation feel so impossible to forget? The days after the charity event should have returned to normal. That was what I expected. Ethan was simply someone I had bumped into after many years. We had exchanged a few words, caught up briefly, and gone our separate ways. There was no reason for him to occupy my thoughts. Yet he did. I found myself replaying parts of our conversation while driving to work, folding laundry, or lying awake at night. Not because anything extraordinary had been said, but because of how I had felt while saying it. For the first time in a very long time, someone had seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts instead of my responsibilities. A week later, he sent me a message. It was harmless. Just a simple greeting followed by a question about something we had discussed at the event. I hesitated before replying. A small voice inside me suggested that maybe I should leave it unanswered. Another part of me immediately dismissed the idea. There was nothing inappropriate about responding to an old friend. So I replied. That conversation lasted only a few minutes. The next one lasted longer. Then another followed a few days later. Soon, exchanging messages became part of my routine. At first, our conversation stayed light. We talked about work, books, family, and memories from years ago. We shared funny stories and small frustrations about everyday life. It felt easy. Comfortable. What I didn't realize at the time was how quickly comfort can become dependence. Without intending to, I began looking forward to hearing from him. Whenever my phone buzzed, I felt a small spark of anticipation. It wasn't romantic. At least that's what I told myself. I repeated that explanation often. We're just talking. We're just friends. Nothing is happening. The problem was that the conversations were gradually becoming more personal. Ethan asked questions that no one else seemed interested in asking anymore. What makes you happy? Do you ever regret certain choices? Are you where you thought you'd be by this stage of your life? Simple questions. Yet they opened doors inside me that had remained closed for years. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, I found myself sharing frustrations I had never voiced aloud. I talked about feeling stuck in routines. About how predictable life had become. About the loneliness I couldn't fully explain. Ethan didn't offer solutions. He simply listened. And somehow that felt even more powerful. Meanwhile, my conversations with Daniel continued shrinking. Our daily interactions became practical exchanges focused on schedules and obligations. Neither of us seemed unhappy enough to start a difficult conversation, yet neither of us seemed truly connected either. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. I hated myself for noticing it. Every time Ethan made me laugh, guilt followed. Every time I looked forward to his messages, guilt followed. Every time I caught myself comparing his attention to Daniel's distance, guilt followed. But guilt wasn't enough to stop me. Instead, I started creating excuses. Everyone needs friends. I'm not doing anything wrong. It's only conversation. Those explanations comforted me until the first moment I felt the need to hide something. Daniel was sitting beside me one evening when a message from Ethan appeared on my screen. Without thinking, I turned the phone over. The movement happened automatically. Daniel didn't notice. But I did. For several seconds, my heart pounded in my chest. Nothing inappropriate had appeared in the message. There was no reason to hide it. Yet I had. That realization stayed with me long after the moment passed. Because secrecy changes everything. The moment you start hiding something, you already know it matters more than you're willing to admit. Over the following weeks, my emotional attachment continued growing. Some days Ethan would be the first person I wanted to tell when something happened. A good day. A stressful meeting. A random thought. A personal victory. I began sharing pieces of myself that once belonged exclusively within my marriage. And although I never said it aloud, I knew deep down that a line was slowly disappearing. Not a physical line. An emotional one. The kind that protects relationships long before actual betrayal occurs. Then came the afternoon that forced me to confront what was happening. Ethan asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. Nothing elaborate. Nothing secretive. Just two old friends catching up. I stared at the message for nearly 10 minutes. Part of me knew I should decline. Another part already knew I wouldn't. When I finally agreed, I convinced myself it was harmless. People meet friends all the time. There was nothing wrong with a conversation. But as the day approached, I noticed how much thought I was putting into it. I cared about what I wore. I cared about what I would say. I cared about how I would appear. The realization unsettled me. When we finally sat across from each other, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Hours seemed to disappear. We talked about dreams we had abandoned, mistakes we had made, and versions of ourselves we barely recognized anymore. At some point, I found myself laughing harder than I had laughed in years. And then, without warning, everything became quiet. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. We simply looked at each other. There was no touching. No confession. No dramatic declaration. Yet something passed between us. A silent understanding that this connection was no longer as innocent as we had both pretended. I felt it immediately. The warmth. The excitement. And the fear. Because for the first time, I could no longer honestly tell myself that nothing was happening. The danger wasn't that I was falling into someone else's arms. The danger was that I was slowly giving someone else a place in my heart that was supposed to belong to my husband. And as I drove home that evening, one painful truth followed me the entire way. I wasn't just keeping a friendship alive anymore. I was protecting a secret. After that afternoon with Ethan, pretending became impossible. For months, I had convinced myself that everything existed in a harmless space between friendship and attraction. I told myself there were boundaries. I told myself I still had control. But deep down, I knew the truth. The connection had become something far more complicated than either of us wanted to admit. The frightening part wasn't how quickly it happened. It was how natural it felt. Every message from him brightened my day. Every conversation gave me something I hadn't felt in years: excitement. Not the dramatic excitement people associate with affairs, but something quieter. The feeling of being understood. The feeling of being important to someone. At first, I embraced it. Then I started fearing it. Because every moment of happiness came with a reminder of what I was risking. I would sit across from Daniel during dinner and feel guilt settling in my chest. Not because I had physically betrayed him. Because I was no longer fully present. Part of me was somewhere else. Part of me was sharing thoughts, emotions, and vulnerabilities with another man. The realization haunted me. I began noticing how much my behavior had changed. I smiled at my phone more often. I protected it more carefully. I deleted conversations that made me uncomfortable. Not because they were inappropriate. Because I didn't want to explain why they mattered so much. Every small act of secrecy pushed me further away from the person I believed myself to be. I had always considered loyalty one of my strongest qualities. Yet somehow, I was becoming someone I barely recognized. The conflict inside me grew stronger with every passing week. There were moments when I considered ending contact completely. I would tell myself this has gone too far. I would promise myself that tomorrow I would stop. Then Ethan would send a message, and the determination would disappear. That was the hardest truth to face. I wasn't trapped. I was choosing. Every response was a choice. Every conversation was a choice. Every secret was a choice. And that responsibility belonged to me alone. Meanwhile, Daniel remained unaware of the storm building inside our marriage. Or at least I thought he was unaware. Looking back, I realized there were signs. He asked more questions than usual. He watched me more carefully. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with a strange expression, as though he sensed something had changed but couldn't identify what it was. The distance between us continued growing. Ironically, the more emotionally connected I felt to Ethan, the more disconnected I became from my husband. Simple conversations became difficult. Shared moments felt forced. Even when Daniel tried to engage with me, I often responded with half-hearted attention. I hated myself for it. Yet I continued. Then something happened that shook me more than I expected. One evening, I came home after a difficult day. I was exhausted and emotionally overwhelmed. As soon as I walked through the door, Daniel noticed. Without asking questions, he made dinner. He sat beside me. He listened while I talked about work. And for the first time in months, I saw the man I had married. Not the distant version I had built in my mind. The real one. The man who still cared. The man who still showed up. The man who had shared nearly half of his life with me. That night, guilt hit me harder than ever before. Because I suddenly realized something important. I had spent months focusing on everything that was missing from my marriage. I had spent almost no time trying to repair it. Instead, I had escaped into a connection that felt easier. A connection without responsibilities. Without bills. Without years of accumulated disappointments. Without the ordinary challenges that every long-term relationship eventually faces. For the first time, I questioned whether Ethan represented a better future or simply a temporary refuge from problems I didn't want to confront. The answer terrified me. Because I wasn't sure. A few days later, everything came crashing down. I was sitting in the living room when Daniel entered holding my phone. The moment I saw his face, my stomach dropped. He wasn't angry. He looked hurt. That made it worse. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. The room suddenly felt smaller. I already knew where the conversation was heading. Apparently, a message notification had appeared while my phone was charging in the kitchen. Daniel hadn't been searching for anything. He hadn't been investigating. He had simply seen enough to start asking questions. Questions I wasn't prepared to answer. At first, I tried minimizing it. I called Ethan a friend. I said nothing inappropriate had happened. Technically, both statements were true. But truth becomes meaningless when it's incomplete. Daniel listened silently. Then he asked a question I will never forget. "If it's only friendship, why have you been hiding it?" I had no answer. At least none that sounded convincing. Because he was right. People don't hide things that mean nothing. The silence that followed felt unbearable. Eventually, I told him everything. Not every message. Not every conversation. But the emotional truth. I admitted how important Ethan had become. I admitted how much I looked forward to hearing from him. I admitted that a part of me had crossed the line long before I realized it. The pain on Daniel's face was unlike anything I had ever seen. There was no shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just heartbreak. Pure and unmistakable heartbreak. And in that moment, I understood something I had spent months avoiding. Trust isn't destroyed only by physical betrayal. Sometimes it breaks when someone realizes they are no longer the person you turn to first. Sometimes it breaks when emotional intimacy is quietly transferred elsewhere. Sometimes it breaks through secrecy alone. The days that followed were miserable. Daniel barely spoke. I barely slept. Ethan continued reaching out, concerned about what was happening. His messages were kind, supportive, comforting. But instead of making things easier, they made everything worse. Because every message forced me to confront the reality I had been avoiding. I stood between two paths. One offered excitement, understanding, and the possibility of something new. The other contained years of shared history, commitment, and a marriage that was now hanging by a thread. For months, I had tried convincing myself that I didn't have to choose. Now I finally understood that I did. And no matter what decision I made, someone was going to get hurt. Including me. After Daniel discovered the truth, everything became painfully quiet. Not the comfortable silence we had lived with for years. This silence was different. It carried disappointment, confusion, and wounds that neither of us knew how to heal. Every room in the house felt heavier. Every conversation felt fragile. The life we had built together was still standing, but the trust supporting it had cracked. For several days, I moved through life almost mechanically. I went to work. I completed chores. I answered questions when necessary. But internally, I was exhausted. For months, I had been caught between two worlds. Now there was nowhere left to hide. The excuses I had repeated to myself no longer worked. I couldn't call it harmless friendship. I couldn't blame loneliness. I couldn't blame routine. The truth was much simpler and much harder to accept. I had allowed another person to become emotionally important in ways that should have belonged inside my marriage. Whether I intended it or not, I had betrayed the trust of the person who loved me. Accepting that responsibility was painful. But it was also necessary. One evening, I sat alone for hours thinking about everything that had happened. I replayed every decision in my mind, searching for the moment where things had truly changed. At first, I thought it was when Ethan and I started messaging regularly. Then I thought it was when I hid the notifications. Then I thought it was when we met for coffee. But eventually I realized the turning point had come much earlier. It happened the moment I chose attention over communication. Instead of telling Daniel how lonely I felt, I had shared those feelings elsewhere. Instead of confronting the problems inside my marriage, I had escaped from them. That realization hurt because it forced me to look honestly at myself. I had spent so much time focusing on what Daniel wasn't giving me that I ignored my own responsibility in the distance between us. Marriage isn't something that survives on autopilot. It requires honesty, effort, and uncomfortable conversations. We had both stopped having those conversations years ago. The next day, I called Ethan. I knew the discussion couldn't be postponed any longer. When he answered, there was concern in his voice. He asked how I was doing. For a moment, hearing his voice brought back the comfort I had relied on for months. Then reality returned. I told him everything. I told him Daniel knew. I told him the damage that had been done. I told him I needed to make a choice. There was a long silence before he responded. Then he asked the question I had been avoiding. "What do you want?" Months earlier, I would have struggled to answer. Now I didn't. Because somewhere within all the pain and confusion, I had finally found clarity. What I wanted wasn't excitement. It wasn't validation. It wasn't the thrill of feeling desired. What I wanted was peace. I wanted honesty. I wanted to look at myself without shame. I wanted to stop running from difficult truths. And most importantly, I wanted to stop living divided between two emotional worlds. I thanked Ethan for being there during a period when I felt invisible. I thanked him for listening. But I also acknowledged that our connection had crossed boundaries either of us should have ignored. Some relationships aren't wrong because they begin badly. They're wrong because they grow in places where honesty no longer exists. Our conversation ended respectfully. There was no dramatic argument. No declarations of love. No promises about the future. Just acceptance. When the call ended, I felt something unexpected. Sadness. But also relief. For the first time in months, a decision had been made. The following evening, I sat down with Daniel. I knew one conversation couldn't fix everything. Trust doesn't return because someone apologizes. Still, I owed him complete honesty. Not partial honesty. Not carefully edited honesty. The full truth. I told him how lonely I had felt. I told him when the emotional connection with Ethan began. I told him about the guilt, the secrecy, and the choices I regretted. Most importantly, I stopped defending myself. I stopped explaining. I stopped trying to make my actions sound understandable. Instead, I accepted responsibility. Daniel listened quietly. At times, I could see the hurt returning to his face. At times I could see anger. At times I could see sadness. Yet he remained there, listening. When I finished speaking, neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then he asked a question that mattered more than any other. Do you still want this marriage? The answer came immediately. Yes. Not because I was afraid of change. Not because leaving would have been difficult. Because despite everything, I still loved him. Love had never actually disappeared. It had simply become buried beneath years of neglect, routine, and unspoken frustrations. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he said something I will never forget. I don't know if I can trust you right now. But I need honesty if we're going to have any chance. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't rejection. It was reality. And reality was exactly what we needed. The weeks that followed weren't easy. There was no magical repair. No instant healing. Some days were better than others. Some conversations were painful. Some memories reopened wounds. Trust rebuilt itself slowly, one honest interaction at a time. For the first time in years, we began discussing the things we had both avoided. Loneliness. Expectations. Disappointments. Needs. Fears. The conversations were uncomfortable. But they were real. And real was better than comfortable silence. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't understand then. Most betrayals don't begin with bad intentions. They begin with neglected emotions. They begin with conversations that never happen. They begin when people stop sharing their struggles with the person standing beside them. That doesn't excuse what happened. It simply explains how easily boundaries can disappear when honesty disappears first. I often think about how different things might have been if I had spoken to Daniel sooner. If I had admitted my loneliness before someone else filled that emotional space. Maybe the outcome would have changed. Maybe it wouldn't. I'll never know. What I do know is this. Loyalty isn't tested when everything feels easy. It's tested when attention comes from somewhere new. When temptation arrives disguised as understanding. When emotional needs collide with commitment. And in those moments, honesty matters more than anything else. Because secrets grow in